Hello, everyone, and welcome to this fourth of our four speaker series on critical minerals governance, co-sponsored by Steptoe LLP and the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. I'm Christoph Bondi, a partner in the National Disputes Department in Steptoe's London office, and I'm joined by Lisa Sachs, the director of the CCSI, and a wonderful panel of four very distinguished speakers. You'll recall, for those who attended the previous sessions, we've already through this series addressed such issues as addressing the right balance between benefits from projects. We've talked about issues of dealings with local communities and the balance between regulatory stability and regulatory flexibility. And today's session is going to focus on the issue of governance writ large, applicable to all members, participants in resource extraction projects. And we have a terrific panel to address these issues. You will look at the more lengthy biographies on our sites, but just to recall, we have Roy Teshtawan, who's the head of the International Council on Mining and Metals. We have Jonathan Drimmer, who's a Steptoe partner and a globally recognized expert on business and human rights, in particular in the extractives context. We've got Tom Mitro, who is a senior fellow with CCSI. He worked for over 30 years managing resource development projects all around the world, and has been advising private parties and governments for over a decade now on governance-related issues. And then finally, someone who needs no introduction, Jeffrey Sachs, an eminent American economist who's and public policy analyst, a former director of the Earth Institute, and an expert on sustainable development. I'll leave it at that. Lisa, did you want to lay the table for the discussion to come?
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Christoph. What a series it's been, and really ending with a bang, but actually not ending because really on reflecting on all of the discussions we've had, it's just huge food for thought. And what we haven't actually discussed, I think, throughout the series is that these questions are really being discussed in real time by governments and stakeholders around the world. Ro, we haven't really, I don't think, in the series discussed the Secretary General's initiative and the panel that he convened last year on critical minerals. And the premise of his panel was that we need to do things differently than we've done in the past. We can't repeat the process in the past. Ro was on the panel, and so we'll bring expert insights in. The panel delivered a report, but the work is ongoing. And another global initiative we haven't discussed, I think, in the series is the emergent effort or the discussion of a possible critical minerals treaty that is similarly based on the idea that that practices to date have not been sufficient to address the various concerns or interests of the stakeholders involved. So the timeliness of this whole series of discussion is incredibly pertinent, and I am incredibly excited for this discussion, but very much hope while it's the last of our four webinar series, it's just the beginning of what I expect to be a continued discussion. One of the reasons I'm most excited for this discussion and for this panel in the context of our Candid Reflections is that the panelists on this discussion are not only deeply expert in this field, having worked for decades, but also are truth tellers and truth seekers, and not only have an expansive view of the challenges and the many stakeholders involved in extractive industries governance, but also all of the practices and the impacts and so on. But in discussions over decades with me have really been able to talk honestly, and that's what we need right now. So the premise of the whole webinar series has been, I will say what it was born from was a conversation with Christoph over a year ago, but based on also my experience having worked on precisely these issues for 20 years and feeling very much like even as they came to the fore again in the context of critical minerals, that we were very much having similar conversations as we were 20 years ago. And that a lot of the purported benefits or the promises of the transformative benefits of critical minerals now, or energy transition minerals for resource-rich governments, really sounded a lot like what we were saying 20 years ago, and without, I think, really seeing a lot of those transformative benefits. So that was the framing of the question is, and I should say actually with Christoph, it was also that there are persistent disputes in this field between communities and companies, communities and governments, governments and companies, and so on. And so, so really this was born from a effort to really critically reflect on the past 20 years and why these challenges remain so persistent, or why resource-based development has remained so elusive, despite what I can attest to be a incredible amount of effort among many stakeholders, companies, civil society, academia, and others to try to do better across fiscal regimes, legal regimes, infrastructure platforms, community engagement, and all. So what can we do differently? That's the nature of the series. So this is hopefully the last you'll hear from me. What I have asked of the panel is to help us think about what are we missing? What remains poorly understood about the complexity of the complex environments in which mining is taking place. And I mean that both locally, but also globally, because mining and value chains are global and the players are global. So when we think about the complexity, it's really a global, and the governance challenges, those are global. So what is poorly understood? What are we missing? What are the dynamics that we are overlooking or mischaracterizing in the various initiatives? And therefore, why have these initiatives struggled to really shift outcomes, unless you see things differently? But I think really the premise of the series is, even if we've seen some positive outcomes in some contexts, at least in my view, what we've been purporting to be able to achieve is really transformative. And that, I think we can probably all agree, hasn't been the case. So what can we do differently? So with that, I'm eager to turn it over to an incredibly diverse panel in terms of expertise and perspective, from sustainable development to the mining sector in particular, to Tom having lived really in some of these most complex environments, working with communities, but on behalf of governments, and now working with governments. And then Jonathan, having worked in legal practice, advising companies navigating these challenges. So we have all the perspectives covered. Maybe for the sake of starting with a very, very different perspective than what we've been hearing for the past several weeks, we'll bring in the sustainable development perspective, because we've been grounded in the mining perspective really for so many weeks. So maybe not only the sustainable development perspective, but also the global perspective, because I think a lot of our discussion for the past several sessions has really been grounded in at the community level or at the national level, and we haven't talked so much about the global level. So maybe for the sake of taking us a bit of moving our discussion, we'll start with my father, Professor Sachs, who's been wrote about the resource curse many, many, many decades ago, and has been continuing to work with resource-rich countries and companies for the many decades since. So maybe if you can give your perspective on how you see the landscape today.
Thank you very much. That was not planned because I wanted to listen first and then reflect, but I'll just say a few words to get started. In principle, it should be good to have more natural resources rather than less, because natural resources provide several paths for development in concept, at least. They offer revenues for government, or should, that would enable public investments that are foundational for development. They themselves create industry and employment, both for direct extraction and processing, but also if it occurs, for downstream industries as well. So having more should be better from the point of view of development. And there are certainly some resource-rich countries that prove the point, that have been able, for one reason or another, to use mineral and hydrocarbon endowments to support development. But there are dozens of counterexamples as well, where the presence of these resources seems actually, in fact, to have been a curse. And the resource curse idea, which I wrote about 30 years ago and have pondered since, is enough of a real phenomenon to uh, try to make sense of it. And in trying to make sense of it, there have been three different lines of thought. One is that there's something wrong with the resource sector itself, that it draws uh, attention and resources away from uh, more technologically dynamic sectors and creates overvalued currencies, stifles the rise of manufacturing, kills agriculture, and so on. So this is the economic argument known as the Dutch disease. Uh, and there may be some merit in that. But the basic idea is that uh, by being the core of the tradable goods sector, a large resource base squeezes other tradable sectors through, if you want to put it in simple terms, through a strong currency. And agriculture and manufacturing are among those sectors that are squeezed out. Then there are two political economy dimensions. One political economy dimension says that natural resources uh, undermine good governance in the domestic society. They lead to a fight for wealth internally. They lead to corruption. It's easy to get rich as long as you can control the flow of vital resources. And therefore, you have what economists call rent-seeking behavior or directly unproductive activities associated with large reserves of gold or critical minerals or oil and gas. Society becomes more a struggle over those resource rents than the productive activity of entrepreneurship and investment in new activities. So that's the domestic political economy view. Then there is a second political economy view, which is that the real fight is not the internal resources. The real fight is powerful outside interests, governments in particular, and companies in the powerful countries that extract these resources at the expense of the local population. And in doing so, are actually agents of corruption in domestic government because these companies bribe uh, governments, or if governments try to resist the extraction, actually participate in the overthrow of these governments. And this is also not anyone's conspiracy theory or figment of imagination. When a famous prime minister of Iran, uh, Prime Minister Mossadegh, in 1952, had the temerity to suggest that the oil under the ground of Iran actually belonged to Iran rather than to Britain. MI6 called up their counterparts in the CIA, and they quickly deposed Mossadegh in 1953. And there's a long, long history of murder, mayhem, coups, bribes coming from the United States government and from Britain. Those are my two favorites, but also from some other governments as well that undermine governance. And I have had the experience in my 45 years of practice as a development economist of being called in by an American ambassador to say, why don't you tell your friends so-and-so about some part of the extractive industry? I've never liked that. They don't call as much in recent years because they know I'm not very interested in having such conversations. But I do think that the problem of the outside wealth is, and the outside extraction is important. If I had to weigh the three, I'd put this third factor actually as the most important. If we could figure out how to keep the big, powerful countries away from messing around in local governance and actually to empower the poorer countries to play it cleanly, they would. I think the corruption comes mostly from the outside. Not that there's any shortage of willing hands inside, but that the organization of the corruption comes from the outside primarily because that's where the power is, that's where the money is, that's where the military force is, and so on. Look at what's happening in the DRC, for example, probably the most abused place on the entire planet of the last 150 years. I won't go into all of Leopold's depredations, but they involved natural resource extraction from rubber and tusks and later mineral deposits. When DRC became independent, the Belgians and the Americans conspired to overthrow Lumumba and put in a puppet regime because of uranium and Katanga copper and cobalt. For roughly 20 years, China had mostly the run of the place. And I've sat with incredibly corrupt officials in DRC who explained to me how hard it is to collect taxes, Mr. Sachs. So an impoverished country that sells one of the most vital critical minerals basically collects nothing for the government coffers from that. And now, interestingly, the US government is deeply interested in DRC again. I would venture that nobody in the White House could point to DRC on the map. Maybe that's a little bit, maybe they cheat and be able to find it. My point is they don't care at all, except that it's got cobalt, and cobalt is now strategic. And so we will do all sorts of nice things for this country that we love so dearly. So this, to my mind, is actually the deepest of the problems, not the Dutch disease part, not even the domestic corruption, though that's a lot. But it's the interface with the outside, with the Benny Steinmetzes, with the US government, with the other powerful actors who run rampant illegally in these places and then get pardoned by presidents or by prime ministers because they are powerful political actors. So what I would like to hear from the mining sector leaders is, what do we do about this? Because to my mind, these countries are in desperate shape. They have vital resources. That strikes me as fundamentally a win-win proposition. That countries have something of huge value. They need that value realized in government coffers. The role of these resources, therefore, for their own development is huge. And the critical role of these resources in the world economy is absolutely undoubted. And so we have the makings of overcoming all of this. The least creative thing to do, however, would be to blame these countries themselves for this, rather than to ask constructively, how can we shape the environment so that the payments are actually made, the money actually goes to education, to physical infrastructure, and so on, and the resources are professionally extracted in an environmentally sound way so that we end up with a win-win-win of the producing countries, the using countries, and the natural environment. So that's what I want to listen for. That's why I was hoping to go last, but you put me on first. But in any event, that's what I'm very curious about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We wanted to be a discussion, so we want you to come back in, but I think that it was helpful to have that framing and that prompt because, like I said, a lot of the discussion, also just in general over decades, has focused on much more of the domestic governance, and I think not really discussed some of those international dimensions. So I think it's helpful to have it on the table. My suggestion would be to turn to Tom next, if that's possible, having lived and worked. Maybe Tom, if you can even just briefly say where you've lived and worked and in what context, and then maybe if you can speak about your experience with these exact dynamics or anything else you'd like to bring in. But I think that you've uniquely seen a lot of these dynamics, so would love to hear from you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Professor Sachs. I always say I've worked 50 plus years in the petroleum sector from a variety of angles. I don't have any mining experience other than both of my grandfathers were coal miners, but I lived in Nigeria, Angola, Papua New Guinea, all the places that we live in UK. I'll throw that one in too because it has its own share of problems. For my first half of my career, if you will, and the last half, I've worked mostly for NGOs and governments and universities. So I've tried to, from that, extract some of the principles, some of the, trying to look at both sides. And I think, just looking at it, investment on its own doesn't really bring benefits. It's only employment and appropriately utilized revenues that can bring benefits. A mine or a well has no value on its own. It's only what value it brings to that country. And so looking at it, how does the value come about? And quite often, and I know you've had discussions about this before, some of the contracts tend to be set up to be rigid and not changeable. And yet that is when things change over time, the contracts don't change. They may have fiscal stability clauses, and the way they're structured is typically at the very beginning of projects, almost all the benefits go to the companies. Now, companies will promise, X billion dollars come about, but that is very much rear end loaded. So if you combine that with sort of some, overpromise, how much revenue the country will get, how much employment it will get, that on its own creates an atmosphere of sort of instability. People get disappointed, the populace, because they're not seeing benefits coming. The governments are sort of put in a position where they have to borrow. And then that just leads to that cascading spiral you referred to with exchange rates and currency and interest, et cetera. So I think that's part of it, that the contracts are set up not to change as circumstances change. And they're also the benefits tend to be, for understandable reasons, front end loaded to the companies. They get more of the revenue to recover costs at the beginning. Yet that's the most sensitive time. That sets the pattern sometimes for the rest of the arrangements. So that is a factor I think is maybe sometimes understated, is that front end loading and the contracts being fairly rigid and not changing over time as circumstances change, prices go up, or et cetera. So somehow if we could build in flexibility in some of those contracts, I know companies don't like that, but it doesn't have to be they change all the time. There could be certain trigger points that set that up so that it could be seen as being, addressing what the current economic and reserve situation is, so to speak. So I think that's a big part of it. And looking at a more micro level, if you look at employment, let's say, and corruption, there's two things that perhaps are one of the factors in the resource curse, is that if you look, I actually taught a course on the the contracting in the oil industry. And something like, in the US at least, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, something like 70% of the employment in that sector is is by the contractors, subcontractors doing oil services, construction, etc. And I suspect that ratio is similar in most countries around the world. So that's where the employment is. And yet there's almost no oversight provided of the subcontractors, at least by agreement. You know, if you look at a lot of the oil agreements, they're specifically excluded from exchange currency laws, from some of the local content requirements, from import duties. And most of them pay very little taxes because of the so-called permanent establishment rules. And so there's a big sector of the industry that is just not regulated and then specifically exempted from some of that. And if you add to that, I did a study also of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations over a 15-year period. And of, let's see, 28 violations in the oil and gas sector, 23 of those were in the subcontracting type companies. That, you know, so, and why is that? So is it just because they're worse? Part of it is because they have to, the operator type companies have to, the major decisions that require government approvals aren't that often. You know, maybe when they first awarded the license, when they're having to get approval for the development, yet the subcontractors, they have to get a new contract every 6 to 12 months. And so the governments, because the agreements build in relatively little oversight or compliance required by the subcontractors, they want to approve those contracts. And that's where quite often it lends itself to some of this, some of the corruption, if you will, because they see they get little benefit from those companies, and therefore that's, you know, when these additional approvals come in. So the system is set up in such a way that it almost encourages this sort of disconnect, if you will, between what control there is built into the agreement versus where the benefits often are coming from in terms of employment. So that's a, you know, a big part of the you know, on a more micro level, as how the industry is structured quite often. And it may be a little different in the hard rock mining sector. I suspect it is. There's more employment there than there is in oil and gas. But so that's on a more micro level. But then on a larger scale, the way the contracts, the broad contracts are structured, tends to create some, from the company's side, it looks, they create stability. From quite often from the government side, it creates instability because they're so rigid and because they're so front end loaded to the companies. So that's, you know, just part of this. And then if you combine that with the overpromise, you know, the benefits that are promised may materialize over 30 years, but the governments are looking at a much shorter window in terms of what benefits in terms of employment and revenue they'll get. So that on its own causes the governments to have to be forced to do certain things, like I said, like over borrowing, creating employment that wouldn't exist in the industry otherwise, and that leads to that economic destabilization quite often. So
thank you so much, Tom. Ro, if I can now come to you to speak on behalf of the whole mining sector, but maybe, I mean, would welcome any reflections, but I think, again, specifically now, if you can respond a bit to what Professor Sachs and Tom just described, both about the global dynamics and some of the local structures and how much those play out. And then I would love if you could speak to the Secretary General's panel, and to what, especially because I actually saw it as an opportunity with all of these world's governments at the table uniquely to have this discussion on the global geopolitical dimensions, by the way, not only of the power, but of global value chains and concerns around concentration of supply and production. This was the chance all the governments at the table developed and developing with the mining sector, with civil society. So maybe if you can speak to the extent to which any of these issues were or were not addressed and any other reflections. So thanks so much, Ro.
With pleasure, Lisa. Thank you. I can certainly speak on behalf of 24 large mining companies who are the members of ICMM, and together we're a third of the mining industry. So it's a big chunk, but I also recognize that the industry is made up of in the order of 25,000 mining companies. So I'm under no illusions that there's a big part of the industry we don't directly capture and who would operate to standards far below what we would consider acceptable. Why don't I start, Lisa, with the experience of the UN Secretary General's panel, and then I'd love to reflect on some of the things that Tom and Professor Sachs said. So this UN Secretary General's panel was, of course, done over a period of 4 months through the course of last year, with the aim of trying to build global consensus around the kind of mining industry we need for critical energy transition minerals. I think it was a wonderful concept, but it was executed badly. It was executed badly for 3 particular reasons. One was just not well planned in the time frame. 4 months is far too short, I think, to bring a range of people together in a common vision, and I think they should have taken their time, which they didn't. The second challenge, Lisa, was that there was an assumption, I think, but it was never made explicit, that the task at hand to overcome the challenges that Professor Sachs and Tom have laid out was to raise the ceiling, as it were, that no matter how good you are as a mining company, you're still not good enough to deliver the kind of benefits to local countries that should be anticipated of you. I think that's the wrong, or at least incomplete, theory of change. While there's absolutely room to make the best even better, our main challenge, I believe, is to raise the floor, which is that there are far too many companies getting away with practices that are unacceptable and should not be permitted. And so had the panel set for itself the task for how do we make sure that there's a minimum standard to which every company is held to account, that would have been a far more effective theory of change, I believe, than the more implicit assumption made, which is that we need to make the largest and already better performing companies even better, although there is clearly room to do that too. But I think it missed the fundamental point, which is that with this very long tail of the industry, thousands of companies, most of whom are not listed and therefore not subject to any scrutiny, operating to standards far below what's acceptable. And the third reason, Lisa, which I think that the panel suffered from, was again an assumption, not clearly stated, but pretty evident, of treating the sector as guilty until proven innocent. Now, look, then that's not a standard we tend to hold anybody else to. And I will be the first one to say, hand on heart, that the mining industry has a huge amount to answer for, which Tom and Professor Sachs have laid out for us very clearly today. There have been absolute abhorrent practices in the past. There's been willful corruption, there's been poor standards, and there's been terrible accidents. All of those has caused real damage to people and the environment. But to treat the whole sector as if everyone has acted the same way, I think is incomplete at best and super counterproductive at worst. And in that regard, I'd like to offer maybe a slightly counter view to what Professor Sachs was laying out for us in terms of the 3 main causes of the resource curse. And I say this with an enormous degree of respect, Professor Sachs, for your work, having been an ardent student of it and a real proponent of the ideas you put forward. Where I struggle, though, is when we looked at the performance of 34 mining-dependent countries. So we took 34 countries who we classified as being mining dependent, and that's based on the proportion of their economic output that stems from mining directly or indirectly. And we tracked their performance between 1995 and 2018 on 41 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we took 41 Sustainable Development Goals, and we tracked how well have these countries done over the last 23 years in achieving progress across those goals. What we found was that the vast majority, nearly 75% of those countries, had outperformed the global average when it came to progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a global average for how countries have progressed on those metrics, and the countries that are mining dependent have outperformed that global average. Of course, what we also found was that the better governed you are as a country, the better your outperformance was. So if you have poor governance, you're likely to outperform but only by a small margin. If you have better governance, so for example, Indonesia, Botswana, Bolivia were some of the ones that were the highest outperformers. And then you had countries that didn't outperform as well, many of the Central African republics, for example, where there was much less performance. But still, when you took that group of countries that we looked at, there was very clearly a sense that to describe the resource curse as something that's universal across countries, or at least even across the majority of countries, didn't seem to hold true. So at a macro level, I'm feeling a sense of dissonance between what we found there and I think the very compelling argument that Professor Sachs has put forward. So it'd be good to get into that in a second if we have a chance. If that's at the macro level, if I take it down to the micro level, I also don't recognize a few of the aspects that have been highlighted today as the challenges associated with mining today. So for instance, I just came back last week from visiting the North Mara gold mine in Tanzania, on the border of Tanzania and Kenya, arguably one of the most complex mining operations, something that John Drimmer knows a whole lot about. And then onto the platinum belt of South Africa, where once again, we stood on the site of the Marikana massacre, where 44 miners were shot dead by the police in 2012, following a wage dispute between unions and companies. To really understand the factors that led to those challenges and what we might learn from them in order to build a fairer, better sector for all. And I was struck by the fact that 97% of the people that worked at the North Mara mine were local Tanzanians. That you had a company that, yes, involves foreign investment from Barrick, the company that owns that mine, but for all intents and purposes is essentially an indigenization program for local Tanzanians to run this company, as they do. All the senior management was entirely local, 97% of the workforce is local. And to some of the points that Tom was mentioning, a significant proportion of the procurement spend being spent with local suppliers who are buying locally and are based locally as a result of a direct intervention program from Barrick, the parent, to ensure that you don't have, as they're called in Tanzania, briefcase companies that are local in name only, but still buying all their product from overseas. And what I experienced there, as I have on many multiple mine sites, was not a sense of outside-driven corruption that is leaving countries bare and with little left behind, but instead, when done well, mining, often driven by international companies, promoting a thriving local economy, which even if imperfect, and clearly there's a bunch of work we still need to do to give people lives of dignity, but certainly one that would be significantly better than were that company not to be present. I've also found that companies who do come from outside of a particular country, particularly in the least developed economies, bring with them a set of standards and principles from their operations elsewhere that they are not prepared to water down just because they're operating in an environment which doesn't require it. Certainly the ICMM performance expectations of our members apply globally no matter where you operate. For instance, you will disclose the contracts you have with governments, whether or not your counterparty is a member of the Extractors Industry Transparency Initiative or not. You will disclose the tax you pay on a country-by-country basis. You will disclose the proportion of your wage as a percentage of the living wage and break that down by gender and ethnicity. You will disclose the extent to which your spend with local suppliers is indeed local, or whether it is then through briefcase companies and so on. And so when I think about that, and I think about the fact that over the last 10 years, for every dollar of profit that companies, it's certainly in our group, I can't speak for the wider industry, made over those last 10 years, we returned 36 cents of each dollar of profit back to governments in the form of corporate income tax and royalties. And that's, of course, before any payroll or other taxes. We also spent $200 billion with suppliers, employed over 600,000 people. Now, as both Professor Sachs and Tom have said, that's fine, but it doesn't mean anything unless that money is well spent. And therein lies, I think, the nub of the challenge, which is that while we absolutely should be holding mining companies to account, and that's certainly what organizations like mine are designed to do from the inside of the industry, I think it would be incomplete to paint the whole mining industry with the picture of the least well-performing companies, of which there are many, but to recognize that when done well, the mining industry is generating significant value for host countries and economies. And there is a real challenge we have to how to make sure that that money is being well utilized and spent. And therein, I also take Professor Sachs' point that, look, if we're not careful, if we're just benign bystanders, then we're not fulfilling our responsibility to local governments to help with that money being spent well. And in some cases, of course, companies can be malign actors too. But Lisa, if I end on just one little story of how, again, the power of responsible mining can be significantly positive. A company like Anglo American isn't just standing by in my home country of South Africa, which of course has the highest Gini coefficient in the world, the highest youth unemployment in the world. And while I can't measure it, I'm confident some of the most endemic levels of corruption in the world, which require no outside help because the South Africans seem very capable of being highly corrupt themselves. What you have is a situation where a company like Anglo American is investing significant sums in independent municipal capacity building programs. The company doesn't train municipal workers, but they do pay for those municipal workers to get trained so that local municipalities can enjoy better service delivery and better capacity to spend the money that is being generated by the mining industry. So all of that to say, Lisa, that while I absolutely acknowledge and appreciate that there's a lot this industry has not done well, it would be really incomplete of us, as I think the UN panel made the mistake to do, to paint the entire industry with the same brush and to treat it as guilty until proven innocent. Whereas I think what we need is a far more careful, more zoomed in analysis of the specific conditions in which mining is taking place.
Thank you so much, Ro. I have one very short follow-up question for you, and well, actually, one very short follow-up question. To what extent on the panel, you mentioned on the panel that it seemed like that the emphasis was on raising bar for the mining companies. To what extent, with all the governments in the room, was there a discussion of the government's role and some of those global dynamics? Was that discussed at all, or was it really about the standards for the mining companies?
To be fair, there was a bit of discussion on the role of governments in, for instance, spending the money responsibly that's being generated. There was no discussion, and to be fair, this was 12 months ago, there was no discussion of the geopolitics of critical minerals. So nobody was thinking, how do we make sure this is done in a sensible way? But the primary focus, Lisa, was indeed on raising the top end of the standard spectrum, not even the bottom end, which is where I think the focus should have been. I think the other challenge that the panel faced was a almost fetishization of the informal and artisanal mining sector, treating it as one might treat sort of, artisanal products in other sectors, which it absolutely should not be seen that way, because while it provides significant levels of employment for people, and while it is an indispensable part of the local economic resilience for communities, it has within it parts of the artisan small-scale mining industry that are illegal. Not all ASM is illegal, but a part of it is, and which generates very significant environmental and social harms associated with it. So there was, in my opinion, a lack of appreciation of some of those dynamics on the ground, and seeing it from a theoretical point of view rather than the reality of mine sites.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to come to Jonathan with a specific question, and then we'll go back to Professor Sachs and open it for discussion of all the things discussed. I think, Ro, one of the other things you mentioned that has come up, I think, in actually a quite interesting way, because the misalignment on this that we don't discuss, I think, may underpin so much of the continued challenges and tensions in the sector, is this question of whether the standard is better than before or better than without mining, or whether it's transformative benefit. And this came up a lot in the discussion on defining a fair deal, which I found, even for me, I think about this all the time, really interesting in what different concepts there were of what fairness looks like. And I think this question of whether we should appreciate, whether it should be sufficient, whether we should be saying, look, you're better than you were before, that's good enough, or whether what underpins a lot of the continued tension is actually the expectation that the benefit should be greater than that. So maybe we can come back to that. But Jonathan, maybe to turn to you, in your legal practice, you've advised companies working in these contexts. And another thing that strikes me, again, building on what Ro just described, and I'm curious if you can share your thoughts on this, is whether kind of myopic focuses on specific areas of risk or specific aspects of governance have meant that we're not seeing the bigger picture and have led to continued frustration. So as Ro described, kind of a fixation on either the informal sector, or actually, I would say, to my mind, a bit of a fixation on the standards for companies to the exclusion of some of these other dynamics, or whether it's, Jonathan, one thing I'm in particular also interested in is the framing of these issues around risk and how that's different from a framing around alignment with countries' national or regional development strategies, which is quite different, actually. And I think from the company's perspectives, the expectation is that the project should contribute to the national development strategies. But if the framing for companies is risk management, compliance, and so on, that's a very different framing. So maybe in light of this whole discussion, Jonathan, if you can share your thoughts on the narratives and what you've experienced in your advisory practice.
Well, sure. And remember, so I've worked in this space for about 20 years, advising mining companies. I spent 8 years as a senior legal officer at Barrick. And so I've spent a long time in-house. And so I feel like I've seen this, and I was in government, I've taught as well. I feel like I've seen this from a number of different angles. I do think that we are we can be quite myopic in the way that we end up focusing on these issues, and I think one of the other challenges is that we often can as Ro has pointed out, make groupings that really don't get to a lot of the individualized dynamics that we see between companies, between situations, between countries, between regions. Let me take a step to the side and then come back as we talk about governance frameworks and standards, and a little bit of what we're seeing now, and a little bit about the importance of groups like ICMM and the work that Ro and his team do. Right now, we are sort of seeing a pullback in terms of global regulation around sustainability and the kinds of laws that do impact mining companies, particularly multinational mining companies. And we have, again, within the industry, a whole wide variety of actors, from juniors to mid-tier, single asset mid-tiers to, of course, global majors. But when we see in terms of the global trends, we are seeing a pullback in terms of sustainability laws coming out of COVID. Obviously, we took a very pro-ESG approach when it came to global regulation. We are seeing a pullback, a lot of it at the direction and instigation of business and business associations. And that might be streamlining permitting and licensing reviews, which may end up meaning less of an examination around environmental issues, climate issues, other issues that will impact local communities, reducing reporting, reducing due diligence, reducing those kinds of obligations. But that's really where the standards of practice that ICMM and other leaders in the space become just so important. And whether that's the voluntary principles, whether that's certification schemes, whether that's World Gold Council, et cetera, these are the standards that will help drive consistency regardless of whatever changes might swing back and forth in terms of a domestic regulatory activity. But these are really the floor. These do serve as a floor. And sometimes regulation can be ambitious and go above that. But at a very minimum, these standards are the gaps against which weak local governance gets filled, right? And so when we do have weak local governance, when we do have these regulatory pullbacks, these are the standards of responsible business conduct that ultimately help develop a continuity and consistency and predictability and good practice globally. But look, I don't want to lose the thread about the role of host governments, because it is really the singular issue in my mind that drives the varied activity that we do see around the world. When we do see challenges with free, prior, informed consent and how it's interpreted and applied, just as one example, with indigenous groups around the world, it is often based on weak or vague or absent government regulation or interpretations that won't span the full spectrum of activities that we think about when we look at local communities and groups from an indigenous rights standpoint. When we look at corruption, certainly, I mean, having been in the room, having worked with, I can't even tell you how many different countries and governments, I mean, certainly 30, 50, dozens. Typically for companies, and there are exceptions to this, it isn't a question of wanting to make payments and give corporate assets away. It is typically a demand that you ultimately accede to, is the way that the profile of corruption actually occurs in practice. And certainly that can be supported by home governments, and we see that repeatedly with a number of governments that I won't mention. But by and large, this is typically a one-to-one request from a government official at a varying level to some corporate actor who ultimately gives in. And again, the governance that we do see and the variation we see in terms of anti-corruption enforcement around the world is a key driver in the distinctions between good practice that we ultimately see. But again, I really do want to come back to the point that Ro was making, which is the singular importance of coming together and figuring out strategies to drive better governance in those countries that are high resource, low governance environments. And there have been a number of ways that we have thought about this, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. You know, we often don't talk about Pillar 1. 10 of the 31 UNGP's pillars do focus on the state duty to protect, and it focuses in particular on areas of weak governance and conflict. We have multi-stakeholder initiatives that are more than 25 years old. The EFTI is more than 20 years old. IFC performance standards are almost the same. ICMM is about the same. And yet we do still see a lack of satisfaction, an appropriate lack of satisfaction in terms of change and in terms of community benefit, despite all of these standards that have now existed for several decades. And the reason is there's only so far companies can really go, right? I mean, there's only so much companies can really do to make those kinds of meaningful and lasting changes that will benefit communities in a way that's consistent and long-term and sustainable. But I gotta say, I do think refusing to place responsibility, significant responsibility, primary responsibility, some responsibility with host governments perpetuates the problem that we currently have and that we have had for decades and maybe even centuries at this point. So it does mean that the international community has to come together in a sustained and robust and meaningful way, whether it's the UN, the OECD, the EU, Western governments. They have to come together and press for robust and meaningful reforms in resource-rich, low governance countries if we do want to have this kind of change that we are all talking about. Not to, again, excuse companies and bad practices for the 24,975 members companies that aren't members of ICMM, but I will say that we are going to have to make these kinds of persistent global efforts if we do want to create the kind of change that we are talking about. And we have seen some efforts, right? We have seen some activities, whether it's in the voluntary principles, bringing government actors to the plenary so they do see about responsible security practices, whether it is forming local working groups, forming local groups in country with multi-stakeholders to talk about governance issues, security issues, safety issues, human rights issues. But this is a drop in the bucket, and I think refusing to talk about how it is we are going to make meaningful change in governance, in low governance, high resource countries is really a mistake.
Thank you so much. And I want to come back around, but maybe just on this last point, because it really underscores why Christoph and I were so excited to host this discussion, is that it does strike, well, I'll speak for myself. It does strike me that there is a lot of finger pointing a bit to where the real problem lies, and that it has led to a lot of initiatives that are targeted toward one specific aspect of the challenge, that in this more complex context in which there are multiple and different power dynamics at play, and not just power dynamics, but also real considerations of resource constraints. And I mean financial resource constraints and all sorts of other dynamics that, targeted. There's so many targeted initiatives to local governance. I would say probably that's been the overwhelming thrust of natural resource governance work for the past 20 years. And then so much work, as Ro knows, about the standards of mining companies that, I don't think it's for a lack of either of those things that the challenge has been tough. So it's been, that's not to undermine what you're saying. It's in a way to agree with it. But also, or at least to underscore the need for bringing together an honest conversation about why it has been. So what are the pressures and the constraints on the governments? Is it really right to say that it starts with them, or should we recognize the pressures also that they are under and the dynamics and so on? So anyway, just grateful for all of the really varied perspectives, and maybe going back to the beginning, if you have now that you've heard all of the comments, if you have reflections.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting. Just a couple of points. One on the question of how we can think about the performance issue. If I remember correctly, what I did 30 years ago in studying this issue was to take a structural model of economic growth in which economic growth is based on a set of identified determinants of a country, structural determinants of demography and other factors, and then to add in as an additional explanatory variable some measure of the mining dependency or resource dependency of the development, and then to find that in a that in a multiple regression context, in other words, trying as best to hold constant other structural variables, having this resource dependence on net was a negative. So that was the technical attempt to answer your question, Lisa, was to say holding other structural variables constant, is this an additional, is this a plus or a negative to development? Now, there are 1,000 methodological problems with that. This is not a controlled experiment where you divide countries, you give half of them natural resources, you give the other half no natural resources, and you see how they do over 20 years. It's a little bit hard to do it that way. So this is observational panel data trying to tease out causal linkages. I would love to get the new study and to have a look at it because very interesting. There are countries that managed their resources well, and usually it's quite interesting to ask institutionally why that is. Botswana is a very interesting case. It's basically one company aligned with government that got it right to manage the diamond resources in a way that would lead to uh, uh, public investments out of these resources. There were other issues and problems, but in any event, Chile is another country that, with all its ups and downs, had an institutional base that enabled the copper sector to function properly. We can identify many, many resource countries. I mentioned DRC as an obvious case that where the resources clearly were a disaster in some sense. Not only did they not propel development, but we can see causally from Leopold onward that they were the cause of fighting, murders, uh, violence, and so forth. So there are direct, easily identifiable cases where the resources have been a curse. But I would love to look at the list and bring myself up to date. It's been 30 years since I did what I thought at the time was fairly serious empirical work on this, and I'd like to update it. And so, since you've done that, I will take a careful look. When it comes to how to make a step forward, of course, it does depend on what's really going on. And my view, as I've said, is that there are too many powerful actors that act with impunity because they're backed by the United States or China or others that simply have the power of maneuver. People who should be in jail are instead billionaires living a good life. There are lots of those people around. We know who they are even. They're usually on the pardon list and so forth. They shouldn't be in this sector. What to do about this is not easy. You cannot rely on Western governments to clean this up. Western governments are corrupt from morning till night. Donald Trump is not going to clean up the mining sector. Uh, nor are many of the countries in Europe, their governments are equally corrupt. This is a business, and it's a good one, and people make a lot of money from it. And so we shouldn't be naive. And there is no international community. This is my conclusion after 40 years. There are lots of interests, but there's no real community. Now, who needs to be at the table? First and foremost, the best hope for this actually, the biggest problems are in Africa. This is clear uh, by far. Uh, Not only, but that's the biggest problems. We need actually to capacitate African institutions first and foremost. And they need to be multinational institutions or multilateral institutions, because if they're national, they'll be suborned. They will be corrupted or they will be shut down. So the AU actually has to work for Africa to be able to succeed. And this is where I would put an effort. Second, we have to get away from the idea that we're pure and China's evil, so this is a Western effort or a Western struggle for cobalt to exclude China. If Africa becomes the location of the next Cold War, God help us again. This is not the way to achieve development. And believe me, there are no good guys and bad guys in this. There are only bad guys. This is not, this is business. Unfortunately, it sometimes looks like mafia business if you look at the US government and some other governments. So uh, Africa should bring the main parties to the table uh, and create a mechanism, by the way, where and here I'd love some guidance, but the kind of private ownership of the resources rather than their sale on open markets strikes me as an invitation for horrible things to happen. The fact that most cobalt is sold in private channels by Chinese companies that have the resources rather than in an exchange strikes me as a big disadvantage for Africa. So I'm wondering also whether there are ways to make the business itself more transparent and therefore more policeable by saying that the minerals should be sold in open auction rather than, no matter who extracts them, that there should be a market rather than private channels of ownership. But Africa running the show for African development, uh, all countries at the table, uh, East and West, Russia, China, US, European companies, Australia, Canada, and so forth, without prejudice of who's good and who isn't good. And the main focus, money in the bank that gets turned into real investment in development, to my mind, is the absolute name of the game. And that can be establishing transparent resource funds. Chile has actually used those well. I think other countries have shown that that can work because they can be put under professional management. Norway, obviously, some of the Gulf countries. But what I would say is that this kind of institutional design is going to be the key. The Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, EITI, didn't succeed, though it was a good idea, actually. But it didn't really get to the power structure and what to do about it. It just nibbled around the edges. But it's a good idea, and it should be done led by, I would argue, the African Union as the place to do it. Of course, when you come to other regions of the world, ASEAN could be a place to address the challenges in the ASEAN countries, though since Indonesia is so predominant in this, I'm not sure that the regional approach would work or would be reasonable. But in the African context, I think the AU is really the only way to protect the interests of individual African countries that are simply overrun by the politics of major powers.
Great. Ro, or Tom, I would just open it up for discussion, but I really
Thank
like
you.
the big ideas, and Ro, wonder how much they resonate.
Resonate very strongly, Professor Sachs. Thank you so much for those really interesting ideas that bring agency back to the part of the world that I think you're absolutely spot on, is most vulnerable and potentially most significant in supplying the world with the critical commodities for the future. I'll take your lead and suggest maybe 2 or 3 other big ideas I've been thinking about that perhaps have a chance of fitting together as a bit of a puzzle to make the next 30 years look quite radically different from the last 300. And we won't have time to go into all of these, Lisa, but perhaps they're the basis for maybe future conversations. The first is that it's always struck me that if you needed to understand the global energy sector and you were seeking good data around energy flows around the world, you have a place to go to. You have the International Energy Agency that, for better or for worse, provides a sort of global service to understand the energy sector. It strikes me as bizarre that we don't have something equivalent for the mining industry. And I wonder what an IMA or equivalent would look like, an International Minerals Agency. Now, I'm not sure that going down the treaty route and the governance of it being the same as the IEA, with governments essentially owning and running the IEA, is a feasible model given today's geopolitics. So one might need to do it differently. But the basic idea that we need a global independent body that is tracking the key information related to the mining industry, and for that to be available as freely as possible to all decision makers, is a fundamentally important part of the system that we haven't yet created. And we're certainly keen as the private sector to play a part in that. But of course, it shouldn't just be the private sector running this, else it certainly wouldn't be trusted, nor as effective as it could be. So one thought is, what would an IMA or an IEA equivalent for mining look like? The second, and here again, Professor Sachs is much better placed to judge whether this is a sensible idea, either in theory or in practice, is that it strikes me that we, and by we I mean both the royal we and us as the private sector, have wasted not one moment to remind the world of just how important minerals are to the energy transition. And that's absolutely right. But we equally know that minerals are important to all sorts of other things, like homes and bridges and cars and roads and things that have nothing to do with the energy transition, but are essential for modern life. So if minerals are indeed so important, then what might it look like if we started treating them like a public good? Now, I don't necessarily mean public ownership and operation of minerals, although entities like Codelco in Chile, as Professor Sachs has mentioned, do give you some hope to, as does Debswana, some sense that actually public control and operation of mineral production isn't always a bad idea, but it isn't always a good idea either. But if we thought of minerals as public goods, just in the same way as we might think of infrastructure or defense or other things as public goods, how might we bring a different mindset to them in terms of public oversight, accountability, and yes, indeed, support for the provision of those commodities? It's something we've been thinking more and more about, is what would it feel like if we treated a mineral as a public good? And the final and possibly most contentious and least practical, but arguably most important idea, I think, Lisa, is that given this differentiated understanding around the past and history of mining, and the fact that people have had very significant lived experiences in and around the mining industry, I think it would be an extremely productive and helpful thing for us to be able to draw a line in the sand for the start of a new chapter in mining. I think it would give us a basis for a renewal, but that can't happen while we're still living with a different version of what's gone wrong in the past. And that's why I would be saying a form of truth and reconciliation process for the mining industry would be a fascinating thing to think about. Now, I say that coming from a country where truth and reconciliation was an essential part of us moving on from apartheid, and it was grossly incomplete. Countries like Canada have had their own truth and reconciliation processes with its own successes and failures. So we know what a truth and reconciliation process looks like at a country level. To my knowledge, we've never tried that at a sector level. And given that I think we need to think differently, I wonder if one might give some thought to what a TRC for the mining industry could look like. So perhaps none of those ideas will see the light of day, but I certainly think that an international agency for mining, a way of thinking about mining as a public good, or metals and minerals as public goods, and possibly a truth and reconciliation process for the mining industry might be some of the ideas to think through.
Well, Ro, I won't put you on the spot, but if this is not something the Secretary General's panel could take up, and you at ICMM with some of our partners could have at least a continuation of this discussion, I think that would come very close to what you're describing and could really help to put on the table some of these. I do think that having these honest discussions help a lot in rebuilding the trust, and then having very practical discussions around whether some of these big ideas are feasible, because to my mind, they haven't really been explored in any serious way, not even in a not serious way. So Ro, we'll take that offline immediately after the webinar, but that's great. Tom and Jonathan and Christoph, let me invite you to reflect too.
If I could just make a brief comment, I have, I complete support of, improving standards and holding companies account for that. But I have some doubts from a practical standpoint whether they really work. If you're having been in this situation, you're negotiating in a country some agreement, or somebody's trying to get a project approved, and then you're right on the verge of it, and then somebody to actually cycle back to say, oh, this agreement doesn't have enough provisions to protect the local community, or to prevent the company from bringing in security forces, or doesn't have enough local content. I think the pressures within companies to get these deals done quite often would override that, especially if the government itself is not as keen on having those provisions. So sometimes those standards are at a corporate level, but then at the working level, quite often that's not, it's overcome by those commercial pressures to get something done, and done quickly. Also, the whole, all the mining and petroleum sector is subject to this commodities cycle, the boom and bust cycle, high prices, low prices, and that makes it very difficult to evaluate performance in a lot of ways, because you can say, wow, well, that happened because the prices dropped, or this happened because the prices went up. And I think that's a major obstacle to really evaluating how well did they do on meeting certain goals, because that just, it's not a stable sector, and from that standpoint, just because of the commodity pricing. So that's just, one observation.
Yeah, I do think shifts in commodity prices do make it very challenging for companies, and it makes it challenging to have consistent government regulation for sure. I mean, one additional idea that I would propose is we see a mix of approaches from home jurisdictions in terms of how they want to look to drive the activities of their companies when they are operating overseas, and it is a really wide variety of different approaches. But in truth, I do think there really ought to be a much greater level of consistency, and that is one area where I do think coming together on the different approaches, and whether this is row through ICMM's leadership or another body, coming together with the kinds of domestic regulations that do exist in home jurisdictions that do drive responsible host country activity, I think is something that we can raise the bar collectively on. Again, I think that the distinctions that we see in domestic markets I think to some extent we see I think we see a much higher level of consistency in Western jurisdictions, home jurisdictions, where particularly multinational mining companies are based. So I do think that is one additional idea. I don't know that that really gets to the underlying challenge of raising local governance in, governmental governance in those domestic markets. But I certainly think for companies and for Western governments, that is one approach that might be relatively easy to at least start driving.
I can quickly jump in. One of the things that just listening to everyone sounds like a disconnect is the, companies that are following appropriate standards, and then the companies that aren't, and the approach that might kind of create a level playing field would be potentially to create some sort of, at the governmental level, a standard for what does it mean to be an international mining investor, and what are the building blocks of that, drawing on all the work that's been done in the last 25 years, and that kind of agreement that could also reflect good practice in relation to development activities and governance by the host states of these investments. So because one of the things that I see is a lot of effective, well-intentioned standards that are having some real impact on the ground, but they're not all being implemented by all companies and indeed by all governments. And so if we look at this as a public good, to take that notion, an international public good, then recognizing there should be an international standard is that is an obligatory standard is maybe another way to go forward.
Thanks so much, Christoph. I actually, it will be really wonderful to reflect on this whole series and put some of these pieces together because and this came up today, but it also came up before, that standards for corporate practices is different from alignment with national development strategies. And again, I'm struck by, even though it shouldn't be so striking, how really different our even goals are within the sector. What is described as, the high bar? Is it corporate performance? Is it not doing harm? Is it managing risk? Is it achieving full sustainable development? And perhaps, Ro, in this next phase, a next conversation, part of the starting point should be to align around what it is that we are all trying to achieve. And I think the benchmark set in this conversation, with which I agree, but maybe there's a discussion about whether that is the right benchmark, is aligning with national that the resources translate into sustainable development, broader sustainable development, and recognizing that this is not at all within the hands of any single actor to achieve. But if one starts from the point of what is it that one is trying to achieve, and then can look at what some of the challenges are, can there be a more coherent and honest and ambitious conversation around how to really achieve that? What are the particular challenges, whether it's power dynamics, resource constraints, whatever it is. There are many things I think that have come up. So I wonder if actually that is one of the disconnects that should be fundamentally addressed, is that standards for mining companies and even best practices for mining companies in local communities is quite different from aligning around national development strategies. I don't want to keep talking. I will say I will give myself homework after this whole series, which is I summarized some what I thought were some notable takeaways from the first couple sessions. We'll of course do the same, but I think bringing those together will be actually quite interesting to see what some of the challenges are that any of these individual initiatives focused on good governance at national level or company level or company standards are missing, including because we're talking past each other in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So that's my homework for a follow-up. But with a few minutes left, let me make sure you all can comment.
Thanks, Lisa. I was just going to support that idea. It would be a wonderful next step from here to consider what that might look like. I think what we will find is that we have more shared challenges in common than we think we do, which would breed a sense of good empathy. And what I mean by that is, Tom was describing the very real issue of front-loading benefits to companies and back-loading benefits to countries in some resource deals. And that's, I think, off the back of a common shared challenge of what I suppose Mark Carney would call the tragedy of the horizon when he was describing the problem of climate, but could be applied to other issues too, where both governments and the private sector face the same issue of short-term incentives. In the case of governments, of course, it is political cycles. And in the case of companies, it is asset managers demanding quarterly returns, both of which are entirely incoherent with the kind of long-term perspective you must have in order for this sector to develop for the common good. And I do worry, Lisa, that sometimes that third category, and I'm not saying there are only three, but if we think of governments and companies as two, the people that own those companies are as important, if not more important, than the people that manage the money on their behalf. And I have seen very clearly that companies rationally respond to the incentives provided by the owners of the capital. And it has been a revelation to me that certainly in the last 2 or 3 months, there has been virtually no conversation in the investment community around some of the topics we've just been talking about today. And that is a very concerning development. And I don't think it's connected to the backlash against ESG that we have seen in the United States. I think it's a much broader global trend of, again, a narrowing of the focus and a focus on the financials above all else. And so with indigenous communities, local communities, and others in the room, the providers of capital, unlike oil and gas, where providers of capital have been deeply engaged in questions around transition, providers of capital in mining, I think, have been largely absent from some of these conversations. And I think we would do well to bring them in.
Thanks so much, Ro. I completely agree at the very least, because I think when you recognize those drivers that are influential, as you say, you realize why some of the commitments are hard to realize. I think having an honest discussion around what the real incentives and drivers are and how they shape actual practices is really important, whether or not we can get full alignment. So fully agree with that. Dad, I know you have to leave, so any final words before you do?
Yeah, thanks to everybody for the great discussion. Looking forward to reading the new study that we discussed. But also, I've opened an office. It's right now just an office. I hope we have some chairs and tables soon in University of Addis Ababa to advise the African Union. And we could host a meeting on this topic with the commissioners responsible for energy and mining in the commission sometime in the next few months, and have a good discussion also with the UNECA and other participants. But I think it would be very ripe for a discussion with the new commission because they're just in place. They need to understand their brief, and the issues we've been talking about are extremely important for Africa's development. So I'd like to host that, and if there's interest in that, then I will buy a table and chairs for our new center and be ready to have a conference together with all of you.
Great. Thank you very much. I know you have to leave, so we will. Yeah. I'll take you up on that offer also because we have been talking to some of the institutions at the Pan-African level that are ready to move from discussion to real pragmatic solutions. So I think there would be great interest in this also from some of the individual governments that we've been talking to. So I think, Ro, we can take all the lessons that you have learned from the panel and try to build on those discussions in a forward-looking way and see if we can advance some big ideas. So I hope that I can entice some of you to indeed join in continuing that discussion. We only have a couple minutes left. Let me also just say how grateful I am for. I couldn't be happier with the way that I won't even say ended the series, but where we've come to at this point, because I think reflecting on this overall series and all of the points raised really feel to me like after 20 years, we're surfacing some of the challenges and tensions that need to be understood and put together as puzzle pieces. And it's also my impression from CCSI for 20 years that these problems or these challenges require real multi-actor coordination, and that we are so used to addressing these things in silos, either working from not even intentionally, but just because when we're a company, we know how the tools that companies have. When we are governments, we know the tools that governments have. And in reality, this requires a coordinated approach. And I actually think that's quite doable when we can come together with I do think that what makes that really feasible is having a shared vision, having a shared roadmap of what it is that one is trying to achieve. And maybe in the sector, it is true that that needs to be part of the first conversation. Is it realistic to have a shared roadmap that is achieving sustainable development in some outcome? But I think if we can align around a shared vision, then we can have a really more practical conversation around the roles that different stakeholders play. And my experience also has been that that is in the really shared mutual benefit of all stakeholders to have that discussion, because it alleviates this expectation that any one stakeholder can solve this on their own. This is not a problem of just mining companies not setting high enough standards or implementing them. It's not just a challenge of resource-rich governments not governing properly. So I think being able to come and saying this is what we need to be able to do, what our part in this roadmap would facilitate a better discussion. And the other thing I find is really often missing, which I think we can bring, especially on the basis of this conversation, are new big ideas, really visionary ideas that are not incremental and that can overcome the inertia of so many practices. Because the other reality of the siloed approach is that we are not incentivized to, no institution really has the incentive to put forward, to take the leap, in part because it's not any one sector's responsibility to do so, never mind the mandate and so on. But if we can collectively try that and put forward a shared roadmap, some big visionary ideas, I think we could have a really quite interesting and productive and hopefully very rewarding discussion. So Ro, I'm committing you to we'll have tables and chairs in Addis. And now that I've used up all of the time, again, this is not the end. We'll continue discussion. Tom, Jonathan, Ro, you're part of our family that you can't get away from us even if you tried. We'll continue discussion. Thanks so much to all of the participants who have been sharing reflections in the comments, which we're capturing, and offline too. And stay tuned for our recap and some next steps. So with that,
Yes,
thank you.
Just on behalf of Steptoe, I wanted to thank Lisa and the team at CCSI. When Lisa and I started talking about this a year ago, or over a year ago now, I hoped that our outcome would be something like this. It's been an incredibly rich discussion, and I was hoping, and I think it sounds like it's going to be the first of further steps. So it's been a privilege to take part in all this and to have so many great inputs and to hear the passion that people bring to this. And thank you to everyone who listened in, and we look forward to letting you know about next steps.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Christoph. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Christoph. Thanks, Lisa. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.